as a witness. To be beginning our committee hearing right now on continuing our study. If we could please have some quiet in the room. If we could have some quiet in the room, please. Thank you. So we're continuing our study on the human rights situation of the Uyghurs, and today we have Dr. Darren Byler, who's a postdoctoral lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington, who has written extensively and done quite a bit of research on the Uyghurs. And welcome to, Dr. Byler, to our committee. We will start with your statement and for 10 minutes, and then we'll go to rounds of questions from the committee members. So you may proceed.
All right, thank you so much. I'd just like to start by thanking the committee for holding this series of hearings on these important issues. What I'll do in my 10 minutes is give you an overview of what's happening to the Uyghurs based on my research. I'll talk a little bit about why it's happening, and I'll also give you some policy suggestions. So based on the mounting evidence, it's clear that the Chinese state is engaging in the mass detention of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslim minorities. This process resonates with the most horrific moments in modern history. In the past, such processes have resulted in generational trauma and social elimination. They have shattered families, destroyed native forms of knowledge, and at times resulted in mass death. Since 2017, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and Kazakhs have been disappeared into a widespread system of education transformation centers in northwest China, or what's otherwise known as Xinjiang. Nearly all Uyghurs and Kazakhs in China have a family member who is interned in this re-education camp system. This human engineering project affects every aspect of their lives. As the scholar Jean Bunin has noted recently, Uyghurs now refer to themselves as a people destroyed. As I observed during a visit to the region in April of this year, the phrase, "everyone is gone," or disappeared, is something that Uyghurs repeat on a regular basis. Many Uyghur-owned businesses have closed across the country. Whole streets have been abandoned in Uyghur towns and villages in their homeland. The mass detention of Muslims was accelerated in 2017 when the party secretary of the region, Chen Chuangguo, with the encouragement of the Xi Jinping administration, instituted a mass evaluation of Uyghur and Kazakh societies. Chen asked security personnel to determine which Muslims were of military age, underemployed, had studied or taught unauthorized forms of Islam, traveled internationally, had passports, or had international contacts. Those to whom several or more of these categories could be applied were determined without due process to be unsafe. State authorities determined that their worldview needed to be, quote, eradicated from society. As a result of this categorization, the police sent hundreds of thousands of these men and women into re-education camps and a larger system. Hundreds of thousands more were formally arrested and sentenced using China's broadly defined anti-terrorism laws. In 2017, 21% of all who were arrested in the country as a whole came from the Uyghur and Kazakh homelands in China. Tens of thousands of children of those detained have been removed from their families and forced to become wards of the state. They are now being raised in state-run facilities that center around Chinese language education and Han cultural values and practices. Reports indicate that Uyghur language is forbidden in these schools. This process has also explicitly targeted Uyghurs in positions of social and cultural influence. The Xi and Chen administration has arrested or disappeared hundreds of prominent Uyghur public intellectuals. Several of these figures, even those who were previously regarded as loyal Communist Party members, have been sentenced to death for alleged extremist tendencies. Conditions in the detention centers are often quite poor. Many reports have noted malnourishment and severe psychological distress among the detainees. In some cases, shoelaces and belts are confiscated due to the prevalence of self-harm and suicide. Those who do not participate in political re-education are subjected to beatings, isolation, and forms of religious and psychological violation. There have been numerous reports of deaths in the centers, particularly among the elderly and infirm, but also of younger people who were in good health prior to being taken. All Muslims in the region now face the threat of being sent to re-education camps. It appears that in many cases, local officials have been given a mandate to detain a certain percentage of the population in their jurisdiction. All Muslims in the Uyghur and Kazakh homelands in China are now in effect prohibited from carrying out Islamic practice in public or in private. They are also, in most cases, prohibited from traveling beyond the limits of their home county without permission. Although the large Friday mosques remain open, the majority of mosques in the region have been destroyed. At checkpoints, Uyghurs are forced to scan their IDs, and in some cases their faces, in order to simply walk through neighborhoods and enter the mosques that remain open. As a result, Uyghurs and Kazakhs as a whole have largely stopped practicing their faith. So why is this happening now? Since 2014, the Chinese state has engaged in what it describes as a people's war on terror. In the government's discourse, only people who look different from the Chinese majority, the Han population, and practice forms of Islam can be described as terrorists. This means that the state is in fact engaged in a war on the public expressions of Islam among Turkic Muslims and on Turkic Muslim culture. There are two major reasons for this. First, since the 2000s, the state has accelerated Han settler migration to the Uyghur and Kazakh homelands in China. They did this in order to develop natural resource extraction, consolidate control over the border regions, and develop new markets. This led to violence and competition for jobs in the region, in turn prompting widespread protests. The resulting atmosphere of oppression, dispossession, and injustice has produced a cascading spiral of conflict between Uyghur civilians, the police, and Han civilians, both in the province and outside of the province in other parts of the country. These incidents, which were universally blamed on Uyghurs in state discourse, were generally spontaneous, small in scale, and defensive responses to police brutality and state violence. They didn't resemble anything like an organized insurgency, although this is how the state portrayed them. Second, in 2010, as part of a larger development initiative, the state sponsored the rollout of 3G networks across the region. This new internet access in 2012, along with a social media app called WeChat, dramatically changed the way Uyghurs understood their space in the world and their role in the world. Almost immediately, Uyghurs purchased cheap smartphones and began to use the app as a way of connecting with each other and with Uyghurs in the diaspora. Since for several years the state had no way of controlling or regulating Uyghur speech on the app, they didn't have the technology to censor it, much of the discussion online centered around religious practice. As a result, between 2012 and 2014, there was a widespread turn towards mainstream forms of Sunni Islam among Uyghurs. At the same time, Uyghur political protests and some larger violent incidents directed towards Han civilians in Kunming, Beijing, and Urumqi began to exhibit signs of religiously motivated violence. Rather than assessing the small numbers of people who engaged in violence as quite different from simply practicing forms of Islamic piety, the state authorities conflated these incidents and new expressions of Islamic faith as a sign of the rising extremism across the population as a whole. They also began to use technological surveillance to detect past Uyghur religious activity online. Through this process, what counted as extremism and terrorism began to encompass hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of the Uyghur population. These two factors taken together led the authorities to determine in 2017 that security was not enough to produce so-called lasting stability. Instead, large segments of the minority population needed to be re-educated and transformed. To be clear, there's never been an existential threat to the nation from pious Muslims in China. According to the Chinese Constitution, religious practice is a protected right. As with most colonial regimes, the Chinese authorities are primarily interested in the land and resources of those they are colonizing. Removing these Muslim populations from their homelands and placing them in the system is part of this process. So now I'll move on to a few policy suggestions. There is now significant discussion among US and European leaders regarding economic sanctions directed at key Chinese leaders and security companies that are involved in this process. There is also discussion of new forms of assistance for Uyghur and Kazakh asylum seekers. I'd like to recommend to this subcommittee that the subcommittee issue a formal statement demanding that Xi Jinping and Chen Huangguo immediately abolish the transformation through education detention system and release all Uyghur and Kazakh detainees. I also call on this subcommittee to introduce legislation that places economic sanctions on Chinese authorities and technology companies which benefit from this process. And finally, I think it would be a really great idea if this committee would introduce legislation joining Germany and Sweden in granting expedited asylum to Uyghur and Kazakhs from China, and a blanket refusal to deport Uyghurs and Kazakhs back to China. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we will start our questioning with Mr. Sweet for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Professor, for your testimony. And I sincerely hope that our final report will be an encouragement to our government to accomplish at least some of those issues that you've mentioned, particularly making sure that we do not allow any kind of extradition of Uyghurs or Kazakhs from Canada. But one of the things that I've noticed over the years from taking a look at the Tibetan situation and now the Uyghur situation, the repression by the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, there never was any kind of strategy to dialogue with either of these ethnic communities in regards to their resources. They always do it by force. The similarity between a Tibetan situation where they moved Han Chinese into Tibet to populate Tibet and to intimidate Tibetans and to try and diminish their culture is the same. This might be too big of a question for now, but in your opinion, is this the strategy of the People's Republic of China to always do things by force in order to send a clear message to the rest of their population that they'll take anything they want?
Well, I think one of the things that they think about is China has an immense population of 1.4 billion people, and Tibetan and the Uyghur homeland, Xinjiang, is seen as a space that could accommodate large populations of Han people from overcrowded areas in the east. China is also interested in the case of Xinjiang in increasing access to Central Asia, developing the new Silk Road, or what they call the One Belt, One Road development initiative, building new markets and all of that. They're also interested in extracting the resources from the region. 20% of oil, around 20% of natural gas that it's in the country comes from this region. But in terms of dialogue and all of that, they do talk about how that they're providing for Uyghurs, that they give Uyghurs help and assistance in going to school. They provide free schooling for them. They provide housing in some cases. Many Uyghurs have been moved off of their land into subsidized housing, government housing. And they see that as a net benefit for Uyghurs, that they're bringing them closer into the nation and also giving them these economic benefits. The process I think that they're trying to accomplish is an assimilation process, and also a process which will allow Han people and Han companies from other parts of China access to these resources. So I think you're right to note that that's done by force. There's not really any sort of dialogue. Uyghurs don't have any choice but to accommodate these things. But I think from the state's perspective, they think that what they're doing is actually quite fair and quite just. And they think that by moving into their lands, they're actually giving them, Uyghurs and Tibetans, opportunities to join the Han nation, to assimilate, to be pulled out of what they call their backward ways. So Chinese often refer to Tibetans and Uyghurs as backward, and those regions as underdeveloped. And so by bringing development, it's a good.
We received an email from one of the Canadian Uyghur community in regards to one of the airports in China that had an express lane for those people who were coming in for organ transplant, and that was part of their communicating with us that there's a large market for organ harvesting and that Uyghurs have been subjected to organ harvesting. Do you have any evidence in that regard, whether empirical or anecdotal?
I have some anecdotal evidence of that. I haven't seen any sort of empirical evidence. It's something that's quite difficult to actually assess as an outside researcher. I've heard from nurses and others that are involved in the Chinese medical system in Xinjiang that they do they have performed these sorts of acts, removing organs as people are dying, basically. I've also met a surgeon who was involved in these things in the past and is now living in the UK. There's strong evidence that it's happening. We don't know the scale to which it's happening. One of the things that Uyghurs are very concerned with now is that in 2017, as part of this re-education push, the state required all Uyghurs to submit DNA samples at police stations, along with blood, their blood type, fingerprints, iris scans, face scans, voice signatures, all this biometric data. They're very concerned that DNA that's been collected will be used to match organs with potential donors, or match organs with people that need the organs. So there's a lot of evidence that this could be happening, but we don't have strong evidence to say that it has or is happening, or the scale. We don't know. We don't know exactly the extent.
Okay, I just want to ask you one more question. We have 2 minutes left of my timing. You mentioned religious and psychological violation. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, we've heard some reports that in the camps, people that do not acquiesce to the re-education curriculum and to the sort of struggle sessions that they're subjected to, where they have to stand in front of others and denounce their past crimes of, studying the Quran or learning Arabic, traveling abroad, whatever their supposed crime is. People that do not submit or perform those tasks well are often subject to punishment, which can range from isolation, being placed in stress positions, beatings, to being forced to eat pork, which is a major religious violation for Uyghurs, and other kind of psychological violations, that are things that are targeting their manhood, their masculinity, all of these sorts of things, denouncing their parents, things that they're trying to trigger certain responses in the detainee and break them in some way. It's not unique to the Chinese case. Other governments, the U.S. government has done similar things to detainees in other situations, but it's still quite horrific. Especially so because these people have not really committed any sort of crime and are not by any international standard should be considered extremists or terrorists in any way.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, and we'll move to Mr. Fredriskatos for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor, are there voices within the Chinese Communist Party, either now or in the past, that have advocated for a different approach to be taken to this particular issue than the one that is presently being taken by the Chinese state? Voices of dissent, quietly advocating behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the past, the Uyghurs have had their own political leaders working within the Chinese Communist Party, and some of those people did try in some ways to advocate for Uyghur rights and greater autonomy. Uyghurs themselves now live in what they call the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, so they're, according to the constitution, granted some autonomy and some rights. But in effect, since I would say the 1990s to the present, that autonomy has not actually been present on the ground. There have been also Chinese communist leaders in more recent past times. Zhang Chunxian, who was the party secretary prior to the current party secretary, he was removed because he was seen as too lenient. It's not that he was actually that lenient. He also participated or advocated for hard strike campaigns. He's actually the one who began the People's War on Terror. But he permitted some Uyghurs to obtain passports and travel abroad, to travel to Turkey. And I think because of that, I have the sense at least, because of that, he was seen as too lenient and too open-minded towards Uyghurs. The reason he allowed them to get passports, he said, was because we shouldn't punish all Uyghurs for the fault of a few, and so we should allow the good Uyghurs to travel if they want to. They should be able to pursue careers and things like that. The Chinese state has now taken a hard line against that sort of leniency and now moved from a hard strike and security positioning to a transformation positioning, where they're trying to introduce what they call a permanent stability, a kind of final solution to what they call the Uyghur problem.
Could I just follow that up? You made an interesting point there about Uyghurs working within the state Can you talk about efforts taken by the Chinese state to, in the past, but even currently, do Uyghurs serve as members of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of decision making? Are any members, have they participated in the cabinet? Here's why I asked that question. I've seen other conflicts, for example, with respect to the Kurdish conflict in the Middle East. One of the classic ways to co-opt the rise of Kurdish nationalism was to integrate Kurds into the Ottoman state and then the Turkish state with respect to Turkey, but the same happened in Iran, Iraq, and Syria as well. Is there something similar to be said about this situation in China?
Yeah, in the past, this would have been a process that they tried to do. One of the Uyghur officials that many Uyghurs look up to, Saifuddin Aziz, he had quite a lot of power. He was the party secretary for the entire region. There's also been Mongol leaders in the past that had significant power in the Politburo. At present, though, there is no Uyghurs that are in those sort of levers of power, have that kind of access. The most powerful Uyghur, I would say, today is the governor of the region, but most Uyghurs view him as someone who is simply doing the bidding of the party secretary, who has the real power in the province. What we've seen in the last 2 years is many Uyghurs of influence, many of whom are party members, being removed from those positions. We've seen sort of purges of those leaders. So the president of Xinjiang University, the largest university, was taken away and given a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve. The former president of the medical university was also taken and given the same sentence. And so what we're seeing is these cultural influencers, people in positions of power among the population more generally, the Uyghur population, being taken out. Even though that were trying to work within the state system, now they're being removed.
I'm going to ask you one last question, if I could. As far as the diaspora goes, where is the Uyghur diaspora most active? I'm guessing in terms of political activism, that would be Europe and in North America, but if you could shed some light on that. And more importantly, to what extent have Chinese authorities aimed to crack down on that political activity, and how do they do it if they do it?
Mm-hmm. So the largest population of Uyghurs in the diaspora are in Kazakhstan and in Turkey. And then there's significant populations in Germany and in the United States, mostly centered around Washington, D.C. The populations that are in Kazakhstan, which is actually the largest population, is very tightly controlled by the Kazakh state because Kazakhstan has a very close economic relationship and political relationship with China. So Uyghurs that live there are quite afraid that if they speak up too loudly that they can be deported, even if they're or silenced in some way. They could be sent back to China, even if they've lived and become legal residents of Kazakhstan. In Turkey, there is some support from Erdogan, the Erdogan administration, for Uyghurs. In the past, there was more support. Now I feel like Uyghurs are being silenced to a greater extent. That, I think, has to do with Turkish politics more generally and what Erdogan has been trying to manage, the situation he's been trying to manage for the last couple of years. Uyghurs some of them are part of the Hizmet movement, the Ghulam movement, which I think makes them makes Erdogan, I think, see them less as an ally, perhaps. And also, he's very interested in maintaining economic relationships with China. Germany and the U.S., I think, have been willing to take stronger stands to some extent. Germany is now refusing to extradite Uyghurs back to China. And the World Uyghur Congress is based in Munich there. So we see them working quite vociferously to elevate what's happening to the Uyghurs back in China. In the U.S., there's some response and some help, but it's also still limited.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess just to continue that line of questioning, maybe it's now we can segue into the harassment of Uyghurs overseas. Do you have any initial comments with regards to what is happening to Uyghurs overseas?
Mm-hmm. Most of the harassment that Uyghurs face overseas in the diaspora is actually directed towards their family members that are back in China. Now, most Uyghurs that are living abroad still have parents or close relatives back in China. And so they're being watched online, their kind of online activity quite closely. And their family members will be contacted by the police if they are seen to be protesting or speaking up too loudly. So that has the effect of silencing Uyghur voices in the diaspora. They're, in effect, holding their family members hostage and in positions of threat and potential detention. Many people that are actually living abroad already have family members in detention in the camp system, but they might have one or two that aren't, and then so the threat remains that the rest could be taken. So that's the primary way that harassment happens. There's also, of course, efforts on the part of the Chinese state to convince Uyghurs in the diaspora to work as collaborators with them and to monitor Uyghurs abroad and then report on Uyghur activities. We've seen this documented in numerous cases. So that also has a chilling effect among the Uyghurs in diaspora because they feel like they can't speak openly because they're still being watched by other Uyghurs. That's the primary ways that harassment happens as far as I've seen. There might also be, Chinese agents that are working and observing, but I don't know any details on that.
Thank you. And so what about, do you know what happens to Uyghurs that are forcibly returned to China?
What I've heard in a few cases is that people have been detained immediately upon arrival, that as they arrive in the airport in Shanghai, Beijing, that the agents will escort them off of the plane. They're often then held in detention for a period of time in the locality where they arrived, port of entry, and then police officers will arrive from Xinjiang, and they'll be turned over to them, taken in shackles to Xinjiang, where they'll be processed, and it'll be determined in a detention center whether or not they should be sent to the re-education camp system, or if they are actually guilty of a more serious crime, one that could result in a prison sentence. So at this point, I would say any Uyghur or Kazakh that goes back to China can be subject to immediate arrest. There are a few exceptions that I've heard of, but I've heard many more cases where immediate arrest has been the result. Even people that had quite significant ties to authorities in Xinjiang, people that had ties in government and had tried to assure that their safety when they returned, have been arrested as they returned.
I guess just two more things, 2 points I want to make, and I'm not sure how much time. Okay, so how is it that China is exerting pressure to have Uyghurs deported back to China? Do you understand how that can work when people are forcibly returned? What ways would there be that China could exert pressure so that someone would be returned to China?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of in Kazakhstan, they actually have extradition agreements, and I think the same is true in Middle East. Some countries in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, in Egypt as well, they've rounded up Uyghurs and sent them back. I don't know the inner workings of how that has gone on, especially in the Middle Eastern countries. I know that in Kazakhstan and other Central Asian republics, there's actually formal agreements. That's part of a Shanghai cooperative organization that people signed on to in the early 2000s. So that's how it works there. In terms of Western countries, I don't know.
Do you have any specific recommendations on how we should make recommendations or how we should be dealing with Uyghurs in Canada and in other countries? Should that be articulated more strongly in some kind of a recommendation, perhaps?
Well, one of the things that's happened very recently is that China has refused to renew Uyghur passports or Kazakh passports for those that are living in diaspora. So people that are on a Chinese passport living abroad are being forced to go back to China to get a new passport. They can't, if they go to the Chinese embassy and try to get a new passport, they'll simply take their passport and give them another document that will only allow them to travel back to China. So one of the things I think that European, North American governments could do is to support Uyghurs and Kazakhs that have Chinese passports in political asylum processes. Nearly all Uyghurs that are living abroad now that are on a Chinese passport feel that it's a necessity now to get asylum outside of China. They feel like it's an impossibility to go back to China. So those are the sort of recommendations I think this committee could make.
To our second round, we'll go to Mr. Tabara for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, and thank you, Professor, for being here today. My question is I'm just trying to get the feel of the central government and how China is viewing the Uyghurs. Does the state have any evidence of extremist acts or violence that Uyghurs have committed, or is this like where is the threat coming from, and how does China view it in their central government?
So, in my opening statement, I told you a little bit about what happened in the 2010s, where there was a turn to pious forms of Islam. The Chinese state viewed that turn towards more pious forms, really just mainstream forms of Sunni Islam, Hanafi Islam, as the Talibanization of the Uyghur population. They feared that the Uyghurs were turning more and more towards Afghanistan and Central Asia. And then there was also a few violent incidents, one in Kunming where there was a knife attack that killed over 30 people. China refers to this as their 9/11. There was also some sort of ISIS-style attacks using vehicles to run over populations of civilians in both Beijing and in Urumqi. People that were killed numbered in the tens to, in one case, 30 or more. So those incidents, and the people that carried out those incidents, they were carrying flags, black flags with Arabic inscriptions on them that seemed to indicate that they were doing some sort of Islamic act in carrying out those violent acts. So China viewed those things as signs of terrorism arriving in the country. And they do meet the standard of what terrorism could be defined as. The problem is really that they're conflating those that carried out those acts with the population as a whole, where most Uyghurs had no desire to carry out violent acts towards civilians or towards the police or towards the state. Instead, they just wanted to live their lives. They wanted to perform their faith. They wanted their children to have a better life. That was their primary concern. And the state is not recognizing that.
And you mentioned in your statement that China sees the threat of the status quo deems a threat to the status quo of how the Uyghurs are living throughout their daily lives, in terms of practicing their faith, and they'd want to change this status quo. I think I heard you say that in your testimony, or in.
Following you, the status quo among Uyghurs?
Yes.
That Uyghurs were a threat to the Chinese status quo?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't think the Uyghurs have ever been an existential threat to China. I think what they do see, though, is that that Uyghur autonomy and Uyghur society as it was preventing kind of open access to markets, open access to the natural resources of the region. And so that was part of the reason why they wanted to re-engineer them and through that process remove them from their land and make it available for Han settlers and Han companies to exploit, to extract resources from. So that was how I understood what's actually happening. But China did see them as a threat, to some extent, a security threat, the primary security threat that China has. But my understanding, based on all the evidence I've seen, is that was a gross exaggeration.
This is a weak claim. And also in Xinjiang province, it's roughly, the population is 22 million, if I'm correct?
Yes.
And are there other minorities that are subject to the same type of treatment? And is it primarily Uyghurs, or do we see this in other different minority groups as well?
It's primarily Uyghurs that are directed, or that this is directed towards, but there's other minorities in the province. There's around 11 million Uyghurs, around 1.5 to 2 million Kazakhs, and another 1 million Hui, which is Chinese Muslims that live in the province. And those three populations, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Hui, are now subject to the potential detention. Hui much less so, because they're not seen as an existential threat in any sort of way. They speak Chinese, and they're quite assimilated into the mainstream population in most cases. Uyghurs and Kazakhs are seen as a threat to some extent because they have territorial claims to the land, or at least they feel they do. They've been granted autonomy in the past, and they also speak a Turkic language as their first language, and so they're seen as radically different. They also appear phenotypically different in terms of their racial profile in the Chinese discourse, at least, and so they're seen as a distinct group that's different from the Han majority, whereas Hui can blend into the Han majority.
Okay, thank you very much. We're out of time, so we'll move on to Mr. Anderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being with us today. You made a strong statement at the beginning of your presentation when you said that this process resonates with the most horrific moments in modern history. I just want to ask you, are you comfortable with the level of evidence that you've acquired in order to make the claims that you've made? How you cite them and back them up? And I just wonder, we had some questions the other day about whether these accounts are accurate or if we can verify them, and I just want to get your opinion, I guess, on whether they can be verified. Are what we're hearing, are those accurate accounts of what's taking place in this area?
I think in terms of the scale with which it's happening, we can say that with pretty good confidence that it's actually happening to that scale. When I was there visiting, it's apparent in the cities themselves that large segments of the population are missing. And then talking to people, as I have, many of them, they confirmed it. Yes, they've been taken to what they call them the schools, or they call them they've gone to study, that sort of thing. So I think this, in terms of scale, it's definitely happening. In terms of what's happening in the camps, we don't have as much knowledge as we would like. But what we do have is reports of people that have been in the camps and then released, which is very few to date. Most of those that have been released were Kazakhstani citizens that were taken sort of by mistake and ended up in the camp for a number of months before being released and sent to Kazakhstan because the Kazakhstani government intervened on their behalf. So the reports that we have is coming from them. We can see that the camps are there using satellite imagery. We can see them being expanded over time. We have data based on those people that left of the crowding and the conditions in the camps, the sort of starvation diet that people are on. Not that they're necessarily, we can't prove or say with certainty that they're trying to starve the population, but they're not feeding them according to basic health standards, enough calories to live comfortably. So people are being weakened through the process. We've heard reports of them, experiments being done with various drugs like tranquilizers and things like that. But we can't verify all of those things. So there is some. We wish we had more data, but it's something that China is not really willing to share with us.
Right, exactly. So I just want your opinion on this repression that's taking place. There's been a commitment by the government to sinicize all religion in China, basically, and I'm just wondering, do you see this spreading to some of the other faith communities? I think this is an amplification of what happened in Tibet, but how do you see this playing out, particularly when the government is now targeting the Christian churches as well and across the country?
Yeah, there's definitely a targeting of what they call foreign religions, which are religions that are not traditional to the Han majority. So Christianity is being targeted to some extent, and Islam. I think Islam, though, is targeted to a much greater extent because it's seen as as a threatening faith. It's seen as an ideological disease. That's how it's often framed, as a disease that needs to be cured, eradicated. It's a tumor, cancer in the society. So Islamophobia is something that's widespread and rampant in the population as a whole and in the discourse that the Chinese state is producing. I think it's a much greater extent than anti-Christianity, but there is also repression of Christians. Most Christians are from the Han majority, and so I think they're treated slightly differently than the Uyghurs or Kazakhs.
Okay, I'm just wondering, last week there was reports that the camps have been legalized, or they've passed legislation to legalize them, or regulations, whatever. What do you think, how does that change the situation? What was the attempt there? Was it just a public relations attempt within China, or who were they trying to convince that this is somehow a legitimate exercise?
My sense is that the legalization of the camps was a direct response to international pressure from the UN, from Western governments, talking about this, from the media discourse, international media discourse that's about talking about what's happening in these camps. And it's them doubling down in some ways on what they're doing and just saying, no, this is what we're doing, and we're proud of it. It's a different strategy, they say, in doing counterinsurgency, but it's a better one, and they're thinking it's something they could market to other countries, authoritarian states that want to control Muslims. But at the same time, it could also be, and this often happens in China, it's a on the face of it is them doubling down, but in the end they might be deciding, oh, we've gone a little too far and we need to pull back. It's too soon to say exactly what will happen, but this is the sort of things that could be happening.
Okay, thank you very much. We're moving to Mr. Fragiscatos for 5 minutes.
Could you, Mr. Byler, can you comment on the place of Uyghurs within the Chinese national imagination, if I can put it that way, within Han nationalism, for example, and perhaps Uyghurs have been perceived from the perspective of strong Han nationalists that they constitute an inherent threat to state identity, state unity. Can you? Is there truth to that? Is there validity there?
Mm-hmm.
And
so,
if I could, with a quick side question to that, to what extent does it explain what appears to be happening now?
Mm-hmm. So Uyghurs are one of 56 ethnic groups in China, according to official framings of it. And for a long period of time, Uyghurs were, and ethnic minorities in general, were permitted. They were celebrated as a form of a socialist multiculturalism. But really only sort of permitted differences were allowed. So Uyghurs could, perform their ethnic dances. They could have dress in particular ways. That was fine. But in terms of the ideology that they would practice, it needed to be in line with the communist ideology. This began to change, I think, in the 90s when the Central Asian republics came into being following the fall of the Soviet Union, and Uyghurs began to talk again about having East Turkestan or Uyghurstan, having their own nation. And Tibet also rose to the fore as something that wanted to have their own state. China saw that as an existential threat to the nation. They have a one China policy. Taiwan is also included in that policy as threats to the nation, and breaking up the nation is seen as something that's be detrimental to the future. So it began then, but in 2001, when the global war on terror began out of the U.S., following 9/11, China began to, instead of talking about Uyghurs as being separatists, began to talk about them as being terrorists, and that in turn amplified the sort of violent threat in the Chinese imaginary. Uyghurs in general are seen as thieves, as violent, especially Uyghur men are seen as threatening, and so addressing that is something that the Chinese nation as a whole and people in Chinese society have seen as something that's important, so they feel safer.
And there are many other ethnic groups, as you say. Is it the Uyghur minority that stands out as a particular concern from the Chinese state's perspective?
Mm-hmm. But they are far and away the most threatening to the nation from the Chinese state's perspective.
Okay, one quick last question. In July 2017, Italian police detained for a short time the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Dokun Issa, on his way to an address in the Italian Senate. What was the context of that? Do you have knowledge of why he was detained by the Italians?
I don't know all of the specifics of the charges, but it's the sort of thing that the Chinese state has used against numbers of Uyghurs in the diaspora. Rebia Kader, who's based in Washington, D.C., has also been described as a terrorist, as an extremist, all of these sorts of things by the Chinese state. Dokun Issa, I think, faced a similar charge. I've not seen any evidence to point to him being in any way connected to violent resistance. He's a politician.
I don't mean to interrupt, but the Italians must have had some reason to act, no?
I think it had something to do with one of the leaders at Interpol being a Chinese national and him putting Dokun Issa on the list. He was just detained very briefly and then he was released, which seems to indicate that whatever charges they had were not substantiated, could not be substantiated, and he was released. He's free to move about now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll move for the final question to Ms. Hardcastle for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So what are our next best steps now to engage China?
To engage them on this issue? I think the sanctions is something that could be put in play. It's also, I think, would be wise to divest from companies that are working in this system, technological companies. One of the things that China is trying to do through this process is they're trying to develop a new form of cyber security and counterterrorism, counterinsurgency equipment that can be exported elsewhere. I've talked to a number of people that are working in the tech industry in China, and what they're developing is something that could be exported along the New Belt One Road, the New Silk Road, because what they say is that on that new development initiative, 60% of the world's Muslim population is living there, and authoritarian states on that development initiative will want to buy these new tools that they're developing to control the populations of Muslim societies. So I think countering that in Canada would be a really important thing to do. Not be willing to buy into those products and those processes. I think granting asylum is also a very important thing, something that you could do in a very tangible way to help the Uyghurs in diaspora.
And Woody, do you see an opportunity with the UN, the periodic review coming up for human rights? Is that something that has potential as well, that we should be leveraging this opportunity? Maybe expand on that if you think that's the case.
Yes, I definitely think that the UN could play a major role in reversing what's happening or exerting pressure on the Chinese state. And so, yeah, leveraging that would be a wonderful approach. I don't know enough about the specifics of what would be available to you to speak with a lot of confidence about what you should do, like next steps and all of that. But I think working with allies that are willing to fight what China is doing and support Uyghurs in their struggle would be a really good next step.
Very much. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Byler, for your expert testimony today. And I'd like to remind the committee that despite the change in the calendar for Thursday, we are going to be sitting on Thursday. It will be an in-camera meeting, which means that we won't be able to have our guests from the public at that meeting, but we'll be sitting at our usual time on Thursday. In addition, I want to thank Naaman Sugru, who has been our clerk for the last for the last while. He's going to be moving on to other things, and I want to welcome Erica Pereira, who at least temporarily is going to be taking over as the clerk, and she is currently the clerk of the Foreign Affairs Committee, so those of you would probably be familiar with her, and welcome Erica as our clerk. And with that, I adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.